The gavel came down so hard I thought the bench would crack. Judge Frank Caprio's face had gone crimson, his finger shaking as he pointed at defense attorney Marcus Chen standing at his table. "Bailiff, take this man into custody immediately." But what happened in the next 17 seconds would end a decorated career and vindicate a lawyer who refused to back down when constitutional rights were on the line. I'm Adam Broderick, court reporter for the Providence Journal, and I've covered hundreds of cases in my 12 years on this beat. What I witnessed that Tuesday morning in Providence Superior Court wasn't just another contempt citation. It was a collision between judicial power and constitutional rights that would send shockwaves through Rhode Island's legal community, make national headlines within hours, and ultimately expose a web of connections that nobody saw coming. The courtroom was packed, standing room only. People lined the back wall, and I'd seen court staff turn away at least a dozen spectators who couldn't fit inside. The case itself had drawn attention for weeks. A wrongful termination suit brought by a whistleblower against one of Providence's most prominent real estate developers, Richard Beaumont. Beaumont's company had allegedly fired Elena Rodriguez after she reported safety violations at one of his construction sites where workers were operating without proper harnesses 4 stories up. 2 men had already been injured in falls before Elena spoke up. When she went to OSHA, she was terminated within a week. The stakes were high. The developer had deep pockets and deeper political connections. 3 city council members sat in the gallery that morning, their presence impossible to ignore. I recognized 2 major donors to various local campaigns. Even the mayor's chief of staff was there, sitting quietly in the 3rd row, his eyes fixed on Judge Caprio. Judge Frank Caprio had a reputation, mostly positive if I'm being honest. 23 years on the bench, known for being fair but firm. He'd handled some of Rhode Island's biggest cases, from corruption trials to complex civil disputes. Lawyers generally respected him, though some whispered he could be temperamental when he felt his authority was challenged. I'd never seen anything that concerned me until that morning. Marcus Chen had been making his opening statement for maybe 15 minutes when Judge Caprio first interrupted him. "Counsel, move along. The court doesn't need a history lesson on employment law." His tone was sharp, dismissive. Chen paused, nodded politely, and adjusted his approach. He was in his late 30s, known for his meticulous preparation and calm demeanor. He'd won several significant cases for whistleblowers and had built a reputation for not backing down from powerful opponents. But every time Chen attempted to explain the legal framework for his client's case, Caprio cut him off. "Sustained," he'd snap before the prosecutor even objected. "Irrelevant. The jury doesn't need to hear this." When Chen tried to discuss the timeline of events, Caprio interrupted again. When he attempted to reference workplace safety regulations, another interruption. "Move on, counselor. You're trying the court's patience. I've seen judges manage their courtrooms firmly before, but this felt different. Personal." Each interruption grew sharper, and I noticed Chen's jaw tightening, though his voice remained measured and professional. His client, Elena Rodriguez, sat rigid in her chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. She was a single mother of 2, a project manager who'd worked in construction for 15 years. This case was everything to her. Her reputation, her ability to work again in the industry, her financial survival. The prosecutor, a young woman named Sarah Blackwell from the Attorney General's office, looked increasingly uncomfortable. At one point, she glanced at her co-counsel with an expression that clearly said, "What's happening here?" Even the jury seemed confused. Several jurors exchanged glances when Caprio cut off another of Chen's attempts to lay groundwork for his case. Then came the moment that changed everything. Chen was attempting to reference a Rhode Island Supreme Court precedent, Mason v. Tech Corp Industries from 2019, a landmark case about employer retaliation against safety whistleblowers. The precedent was directly on point, essential to his client's case. But when Chen began to explain its relevance, Judge Caprio slammed his hand on the bench hard enough that the court reporter jumped. "Mr. Chen, I've warned you repeatedly. You're testing this court's patience." Chen straightened his shoulders. His voice was calm, but clear enough that everyone in that courtroom heard every word. "Your Honor, with respect, I'm entitled to present my client's case. The precedent I'm citing is directly applicable to the retaliation claim, and the jury needs to understand you're entitled to nothing more than what this court allows." Caprio's voice had risen to a near shout, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "This is my courtroom, and you will proceed as I direct or you won't proceed at all. I've been on this bench for over 2 decades, and I will not have some young attorney tell me what a jury needs to hear." The silence that followed was suffocating. Chen stood motionless for a moment, and I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He glanced at his client, saw the fear and hope warring in her face, then looked back at the judge. When he spoke, his words were deliberate, measured, but they carried the weight of a man who'd made his choice. "Your Honor, I cannot in good conscience proceed without being able to present the applicable law to this jury. My client deserves a fair trial, and I have an ethical obligation to provide effective representation. What's happening here appears to be a systematic prevention of that representation." The gavel came down like thunder. "That's it! Bailiff!" 2 court officers moved toward the defense table. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. One of the jurors gasped audibly. A woman in the gallery said, "Oh my God," loud enough for everyone to hear. Chen didn't move, didn't resist, but he kept speaking, his voice steady even as the bailiffs approached. "Your Honor, I'd like to state for the record that this arrest appears to be in retaliation for my representation of a whistleblower against a politically connected defendant and in violation of my First Amendment rights to—" "Remove him!" Caprio's face had gone from red to almost purple. "Contempt of court! 30 days in the adult correctional institutions, and I'm considering a referral to the bar for his conduct." That's when David Morgenstern stood up. I'd noticed him earlier, sitting in the second row of the gallery. Morgenstern was something of a legend in Rhode Island legal circles, a former federal prosecutor turned defense attorney who'd argued cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. He was 68 years old, silver-haired, and wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car. He'd trained at least a quarter of the practicing attorneys in Rhode Island during his time teaching at Roger Williams Law School. "Your Honor," his voice cut through the chaos like a blade, "I'm attorney David Morgenstern, Rhode Island Bar number 1247, and I'd like to address the court." Judge Caprio's eyes narrowed. "This is not the time, counselor. Sit down." Morgenstern didn't sit down. The temperature in that courtroom dropped 20 degrees. You don't accuse a sitting judge of misconduct in their own courtroom. It's professional suicide. Every lawyer in the gallery knew it. But Morgenstern stood there, unflinching, his hand resting calmly on the rail in front of him. I pulled out my phone and started recording, as had at least a dozen other people in the courtroom. Caprio's voice was ice. "You're out of order, counselor. Sit down or join Mr. Chen in custody." "Then I suppose I'll be joining him," Morgenstern replied evenly, "because I'm not sitting down until this record reflects that you've systematically prevented defense counsel from presenting his case, in apparent favor of a defendant with well-documented political and personal connections to this court." The courtroom exploded. Reporters were already typing frantically on their phones and laptops. The prosecutor looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor. Elena Rodriguez had tears streaming down her face, and Judge Caprio, his hand was actually shaking as he reached for his gavel again. But before he could bring it down, something unexpected happened. Another attorney stood up. Jennifer Harding, a civil rights lawyer who'd made her name suing police departments. Then another, Thomas Wu, who'd argued employment discrimination cases for 30 years. Within 30 seconds, 7 lawyers in that gallery were on their feet. I recognized most of them, prominent defense attorneys, civil rights lawyers, even Patricia Donnelly, a former Rhode Island Attorney General. They stood in silence, a wall of professional solidarity that said more than any words could. One of the bailiffs, a veteran officer named Tom Rodriguez, who I'd known for years, leaned close to Judge Caprio and whispered something urgent. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw Caprio's face change. The rage drained away, replaced by something else. Fear, realization, whatever he saw in that courtroom. The standing lawyers, the recording smartphones, the historical moment unfolding. It finally penetrated. "This court is in recess," he said, his voice suddenly small. He stood up quickly, almost stumbling, and disappeared through the door to his chambers. The next 3 hours were chaos. The story hit social media within minutes. Caprio contempt started trending on Twitter. Legal experts from across the country started weighing in. Professor Jonathan Turley from George Washington Law School posted a thread about judicial overreach. The ACLU of Rhode Island issued a statement calling for an immediate investigation. By noon, a formal complaint had been filed with the state's Commission on Judicial Tenure and Discipline. By 2 o'clock, a recording of the incident had been viewed over 2 million times. But the real story, the one that made this backfire so spectacularly, came out during the afternoon session. When court reconvened with a different judge presiding, Judge Margaret Sullivan, who'd been pulled from another trial, Marcus Chen presented evidence that sent ripples through the courtroom. Judge Caprio hadn't just known defendant Richard Beaumont socially, they were business partners. Chen laid it out methodically. 3 years earlier, Caprio had invested $200,000 in one of Beaumont's real estate ventures, a luxury condo development in Providence's jewelry district. The investment was documented in LLC filings with the Secretary of State's office. They'd attended ribbon-cutting ceremonies together. They'd been photographed at charity galas together, with Beaumont's arm around Caprio's shoulders. State judicial ethics rules didn't just suggest recusal in such circumstances. They demanded it. Any reasonable person would question whether a judge could be impartial when his business partner was a defendant. But Caprio had never disclosed the relationship. When Chen filed a recusal motion 2 weeks before trial, citing the social connection he'd discovered, Caprio had denied it in a brief 2-sentence order claiming insufficient grounds. Now, the morning's behavior made perfect sense. Caprio hadn't been having a bad day or struggling with anger management. He'd been deliberately sabotaging Chen's case to protect his business partner and his investment. Every interruption, every sustained objection, every attempt to prevent Chen from presenting evidence, it was all calculated to tilt the trial toward Beaumont. The arrest had been his fatal mistake. By attempting to jail Chen for doing his job, Caprio had created a public record of judicial overreach that couldn't be explained away or buried in legal technicalities. The video of those 7 lawyers standing in solidarity went viral. It was shown on every local news broadcast that evening. The Providence Journal ran it on the front page. The Boston Globe picked it up. Then CNN. By the end of the week, it had been viewed over 15 million times. Legal scholars wrote op-eds about the incident. Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Tribe called it a textbook example of why judicial accountability matters. Constitutional law professors used it as a teaching example in classes across the country. The incident became a rallying cry about judicial accountability and the courage required to stand up to power, even at great personal risk. 3 days later, Judge Frank Caprio submitted his resignation. The statement from his lawyer claimed he was retiring for personal health reasons and to spend more time with family. But everyone knew the truth. The commission's investigation would have ended his career anyway. They'd already subpoenaed his financial records. The Attorney General's office had opened a criminal investigation into whether he'd violated conflict of interest laws. This way, he at least got to leave with his pension intact, though his reputation was destroyed. The aftermath continued to unfold. The Rhode Island Bar Association launched a review of all cases Caprio had presided over in the past 5 years where Beaumont or his companies were involved. They found 3 other cases where Caprio had ruled in Beaumont's favor, including 2 that resulted in significant financial judgments. Those cases were reopened. Richard Beaumont's company faced a separate investigation by OSHA, which resulted in over $800,000 in fines for safety violations. 2 of his construction sites were temporarily shut down. The negative publicity cost him several major contracts. The wrongful termination case went forward under Judge Sullivan. Elena Rodriguez ultimately won a jury verdict of $2.8 million, one of the largest employment retaliation verdicts in Rhode Island history. When the jury foreman read the verdict, Elena collapsed in tears, and even some jurors were crying. But more importantly, the incident sparked real change. The Rhode Island legislature passed what they called the Chen Rule, requiring automatic review of any contempt citation issued against an attorney making good-faith arguments about legal precedent or client rights. They also strengthened judicial disclosure requirements and created an independent office to review recusal motions. I caught up with Marcus Chen a few weeks later at a Rhode Island Bar Association event. He was modest about the whole thing, almost embarrassed by the attention. "I just did what any attorney should do," he told me over a glass of wine in the hotel bar. "Sometimes you have to trust that the system, even when it fails in the moment, will eventually correct itself," But I won't lie. Seeing those lawyers stand up with me, David Morgenstern risking everything, that's something I'll never forget. That's when I knew we'd win, even if it took time. David Morgenstern, characteristically, was more philosophical when I interviewed him at his downtown office. The law only works when people are willing to risk something to defend it, he said, leaning back in his leather chair. Marcus risked his freedom that morning. Those of us who stood with him risked our reputations, our relationships with the court, our ability to practice effectively. But that's the price of a functioning justice system. Someone has to be willing to say no when power oversteps its bounds. If we don't, we're not lawyers, we're just well-dressed bureaucrats. What struck me most, covering this story, wasn't just the dramatic courtroom confrontation, or even Judge Caprio's spectacular downfall. It was the reminder that our legal system depends on individual courage at critical moments. Marcus Chen could have backed down, apologized, and moved on. Judge Caprio's power over him in that moment was nearly absolute. One word, one gesture, and Chen could have been disbarred, his career destroyed. But he chose principle over convenience. And that choice created a ripple effect that changed policy, protected countless future defendants, and reminded everyone that justice requires constant vigilance. I've covered hundreds of trials, seen thousands of legal arguments, watched dozens of judges make rulings good and bad, but I've never seen anything quite like what happened that Tuesday morning. The gavel came down, the arrest was ordered, and in trying to silence one attorney's voice, Judge Frank Caprio ensured it would be heard around the country. That's not just a legal story. That's a reminder of something more fundamental about justice and the people who fight for it, and the cost when those entrusted with upholding justice betray that trust. Sometimes the system breaks, but sometimes, when broken badly enough and publicly enough, it finally learns to fix itself. All it takes is one person willing to stand up and say, "This isn't right," and a few more willing to stand with them, regardless of the consequences. The last time I saw Marcus Chen, he was presenting oral arguments before the Rhode Island Supreme Court on an unrelated case. Different courtroom, different judges, different stakes. But when he stood at that podium, I noticed something. Several attorneys in the gallery watched him with obvious respect, including all 7 who'd been in that courtroom the day everything changed. They nodded at him when he finished his argument. It was subtle, but the message was clear. They'd stand with him again if needed. Power without accountability is tyranny, even in a courtroom, especially in a courtroom where people's lives and livelihoods hang in the balance. But courage, it turns out, is contagious. And sometimes justice just needs someone brave enough to stay standing when the gavel comes down, and to trust that others will stand with them. Frank Caprio's nameplate came down from his courtroom the following Monday. The Providence Journal ran a story about his fall from grace, his 23-year career overshadowed by one morning's corruption. But the real story wasn't his downfall. It was Elena Rodriguez getting justice. It was Marcus Chen proving that one lawyer with courage can change the system. It was 7 attorneys risking everything for principle. That's the story I'll remember. That's the story that matters.